Well, today we're going to talk to you about mounting an ICF system on a Geringhoff corn head. And when you get your ICF system from us aftermarket, you're going to get it in a crate like this. It's going to come with all of these parts in here. And also in there, there's going to be a listing of the parts that are in here, and an assembly manual and a parts manual. And the first thing you want to do when you get this kit is you want to unpack all this crate, lay everything out, make sure that we've sent everything that you need for this, check against the list, look at the parts book, and just make sure that it's all here. Today we're going to go through the assembly of a 2-arm ICF reel. And one of the first things you want to do when you get your kit is lay out all your parts, get yourself familiar with what's in the kit. The kit consists of the reel paddles, the reel arms, the tube that the paddles mount to, some support tubes, hardware package, brackets, a central hydraulic kit. Get yourself familiar with all the different components in the kit. Check to see everything appears to be there. In the assembly manual, there's going to be a list of the parts. Once you kind of make sure you've got everything, we're ready to start. One of the common questions that comes up when assembling these is how tight to tighten the bolts. And in the manual, one of the pages in there is a chart for the torques, and that's all we use is this basic torque chart. If there is anything special, it will be denoted in the text of the assembly instructions. Otherwise, just go by the torque chart. One of the first steps for the assembly is to determine if we have brackets on the head or if we have to add mounting brackets for the arms. On this particular head, we already have brackets welded on there from the factory. If they weren't there, then we would need to add on these bolt-on brackets. There's a chart in the manual that's going to tell us where they're located. The measurement for mounting these brackets is based off of the center of the head, so you measure from the center of the head out to each side based on what the dimensions are for your head. This being an 8-row 30, we would look in the chart for 8-row 30 and determine where these would have gotten mounted. If we are mounting the bolt-on ones, when we are all done, we're going to want to weld these. So once you've determined where they mount, you would grind some of the paint off the frame, grind some of the paint off here, so that once everything is completely assembled, we can go back and weld these in place. For these bolt-on brackets, before we weld them, we're going to leave them loose for a while. We'll just tighten the bolts. That way, if we need to move something later on, if something doesn't line up quite where it needs to, we can move these brackets a little bit. Once we've got everything in place and we're ready to start setting measurements for the reel height, then we're going to come back and weld these brackets in place so that they're permanently mounted. After we've got our brackets mounted, or in the case where they're already welded on, the next step is going to be to install the arms. The arms are retained with the pins. So if you don't use the bolt-on brackets, take and pull one of the pins out of the bolt-on bracket. This is used for the main pivot. And then in your hardware kit is going to be a bolt and a spacer. This is used for the lower mount for the hydraulic cylinder. So we'll go ahead and we're going to mount the 2 arms. This is a case where you should either have a hoist to use or a helper. The arms are heavy, and you need to have someone to help you get them in place, or some way of supporting the arms. This sleeve goes into the eye bolt, and then the bolt goes through the 2 holes in the bracket. In our assembly instructions in the drawings, they refer to these arms here as A and B. A is going to be on the left side, B is going to be on the right. And the fittings then are also labeled as such. All the fittings on this arm are listed as A fittings. All the fittings that go on that arm are B fittings for the hydraulic system. So on this one, we're going to have an AR2 and an AR3. The reason we got AR2 is we have one fitting here we're not using. This would be AR1. The A arm, right-hand side, number 1. A fitting, right-hand side, number 2. Right-hand side, A arm, number 3. And behind it, capped on this arm, is AR number 4. After we've got our arms installed, the next thing we want to do is put this support tube across between the two arms. One thing to make note of on these is that there's an eccentric ring that goes on the inside of each arm, right here. So you want to make sure you slide that onto the tube as you're putting the tube across. It works best just to start from one end and push it through, slide the ring on. When you get to the other arm, slide the ring on the other side and finish pushing the tube through. And then we have another ring like this that goes on the outside of each arm, and we lock this support tube in place on the lift arms. After we have the tube in, our eccentric rings on the middle, pay attention when you're putting these on that which side the recess is pointing so that they'll tighten up onto the collar when we're done. Kind of center the tube so we have about the same amount sticking out of each end. Slide the two eccentric rings on. Tighten them up to set the set screws. And then we would put this plug in the end of this tube. Put a little silicone or any other suitable adhesive on it. I'm going to use silicone. And put that plug into the end here just to keep the dirt and the debris from getting inside this tube. After installing our support tube on the arms, the next thing we would start to work on is the central hydraulics. In this head we have a end row augers already installed, so we're going to take these lines here loose and move them out of the way for now. We're going to mount some brackets across the back of the head to support that central hydraulics, and we're going to mount this splash plate in the middle of the head right underneath where the valve body is going to mount. For these brackets here that go onto the head to hold the central hydraulic, there are already holes drilled in the head. They're covered with some round discs of tape. Just peel them off. And then we're going to attach these brackets with some self-tapping bolts. There's going to be 3 on each side. After we have our brackets mounted, we're ready to mount our central hydraulic system. As you'll see, it's all pre-assembled, all the lines are installed, hoses are all installed. The hoses all have tags on them. They'll identify where they're going to go to the different components on the head. So it's just a matter of setting this in here. And then there are going to be 2 bolts here that will bolt it to the frame. And then we'll be ready to lay out our hoses and make our hose connections. The central hydraulic is going to come pre-plumbed for the end row augers, so we can at any time take these 2 lines here off completely. I'm going to leave them for right now, but you take them off completely. If you have a head that does not have end row augers, you'll have 2 extra lines here that you can just take off. They don't connect to anything, but they are here to connect end row augers when we install a central hydraulic system for an ICF. After we have our central hydraulic system installed on the head here, we're ready to start running our hoses. So we just come through and we'll cut our zip ties, holding all our hoses in place here. And like I said before, all these hoses have labels on them to identify where they go. And we just need to go through and match them up with the mating fittings. And on this bulkhead, they're laser cut in here, the different identifications for the hose, like P3, a B4, an L3, a T3, and a B5. And when you look at the hoses, there's an L3, P3, T3, B4, B5, and it's labeled here. This is for the bulkhead. So all these hoses will go to this bulkhead. There's a mating set on the other side. The hoses go to that bulkhead. Then these hoses here are labeled for going to our single point. These two hoses here are labeled for going to our deck plate. So we're going to replace the existing hoses that are here for these hoses that come on this kit. These two lines will connect from the single point to the hydraulic block on the center of the head, be our supply lines for all the different functions of deck plates, reel lift, reel fore and aft. After we have our hoses all installed, we can now clamp these lines in place on the back of the frame. Just like for the center hydraulic mounting for those brackets, there are already pre-drilled holes here. So all we need to do is pull the little pieces of tape that cover them off, put the clamps where we want them to be. And then using self-tapping bolts out of the kit, we'll just bolt these in place. Now I've got all my bulkhead fittings attached. I'm going to replace my end row auger supply lines here. On this end, we're going to have some different hoses. These hoses here are going to be a little bit too short, so we'll replace them with these two hoses here, connect them to the existing fittings on the steel lines. On the other end, we're going to replace the fittings with new lines on the other end. We're going to move our supply lines and our case drain return lines from the old fittings onto these new lines on the central hydraulics. So one of the next things we're going to install is we're going to put the hydraulic steel lines on that go between the two arms. They mount to this support tube. In the tube, there are already holes pre-drilled in here. They may not always be, but most of the time there should be holes drilled here for mounting these clamps on here. So we just lay it up on here, clamp it in place, and we would connect our steel lines with the rubber hoses on each end to the hydraulic cylinders. One thing to make note of is that the lines are labeled. So you want to make sure you've got the right ends pointed the right way so that when you hook the lines up that you have the labels so it'll match up. So this is the B line, BL1 and BL4. So being that A is on the left-hand side, B is on the right. On this other end. These are labeled AR2 and AR3. AR2 is labeled on here, AR3 is here. So we'll go ahead and we'll get these installed. So after we've got all our hydraulics hooked up on the head, the lines run through all the cylinders, the last thing for the hydraulics we need to change is to replace the single point coupler here. We're going to put this one on instead. What's different about this one is we have this valve here that allows us to switch between running the end row augers and the reel or just the end row augers. So we're going to change that out. There's instructions in the assembly manual. It's going to have a page that shows the single point and all the different fittings and the connection points. The hoses on the central hydraulics are labeled with connection points, and just refer to the drawing and the hose labeling to replace the single point from the one that was on the head to this one that we've supplied. Couple things about the installation of this coupler here. If this had been a head without end row augers, we would not have this hose here. We would have had a hose in the kit and some fittings to go from this fitting here to this fitting here to bypass the oil directly back to the combine for the reservoir return. Also on this valve, there's a blue knob on the handle in here that you can turn in and out to regulate the flow of the oil to the end row augers independent of the flow to the reel. So we can adjust the speed of the end row augers independent of the reel. One other thing I ran into on this head is that where this valve mounted, that this handle is going to contact the frame. So what you have to do is just take the handle off, turn it to the other side, and put it back on so we change the direction the handle moves. So one position is going to send oil to both the reel and the end row auger, and the other position it's just going to send the oil directly to the end row augers. That way we can have the reel running and the augers together if we want, or if you just want the end row augers and the reel turned off, it's a matter of changing that. After we've got all our hoses tight and everything is where we want it to be, we want to protect these hoses on both sides. In the kit's going to be a piece of this spiral hose wrap, and you just take and work it on and work it around the hose, kind of like this, and just work it around until we have it covering the hose and it's all protected. Now that we have all our hydraulic lines installed and all the hoses installed on the arms for the reel, one of the next things we can do is do the electrical connections that need to be done. Originally your head was going to have a control box or monitor up in the cab, and it's going to have no buttons on it at all. It's just going to be a blank face with the readout for the speed and the deck plates. You're going to be replacing it with this 4-button monitor here that's going to give us the ability to control deck plate function, reel fore and aft, and reel lift. So this is going to go into the cab. Your existing monitor and all the wiring harnesses associated with that is going to come out. And up in the cab, we're going to install this junction box here. And it has a plug on the end to plug the monitor in. Another end of the cable here has a cigarette plug lighter on it for plugging it into the cab for power. Or you can take the plug off and wire it direct to a plug in the cab. The only thing to make note of if you're going to do that is that the blue wire on this plug is the ground wire. And then going into this junction box, we have an open port. And we're going to route this wiring harness from down on the head, up along the feeder house, and into the cab somewhere. And it's got just blank wires on it right now. It's not connected to anything. They're joined together in groups, and all we need to do is take the cover off of here. There's a wiring diagram under this cover. Match up the wire colors inside this box and attach these wires to the existing terminals in there. There's also this wiring harness here. It's going to go onto the job computer. It's going on to the cable that's labeled as X1. And it just plugs right in, snaps on. And it's going to go across the head, and it's going to connect to the existing plug from the deck plate and the speed monitor that was already there. And it's just going to connect together. that. And now this plug here becomes the plug that connects to the wiring harness from the combine. Now that we've completed all our hydraulic connections and our electrical connections, we're ready to bleed the system. The thing to do before we actually start that process is just go through the whole head, check all the connections and tighten them up. Most of these pre-installed connections on the central hydraulic are going to be hand tight. They're left hand tight so that we can move them easily if we have to reposition a hose or an elbow. So just go through and check all the connections on all the fittings, make sure they're all tight. And then we can hook it to the combine, start the combine, and go through the process of bleeding the cylinders on the reel lift and the reel fore and aft. At this point, we have not put the tube in the front for the paddles to go on. We don't want that in there right now because when we first bleed these arms out, they're not going to move together. And if that tube was in there, we run the chance of bending that tube or cracking it. So we'd start, slowly operate the hydraulic system, move the cylinders a little bit each way, slowly get some oil built up into them, and then operate them the full stroke, hold the hydraulics at the end of each stroke so we push all the air out. Do both the fore and aft and the reel lift. Once it's fully bled out, then we can put the tube in for the paddles and put the paddles on. Now I'm happy that these arms are traveling together equally. We'll switch to the reel fore and aft. So we're ready now to put the reel tubes in. For the left-hand side, it's going to be a short tube. 6 bolts here, just take them out, slide this on, tighten the bolts back up and secure it. For the other tube, we have to slide it through the bearing at the other end. There's this eccentric ring that goes on, so you make sure you put that on facing the right direction. We're going to use this to lock this tube to the other arm. We have a set screw in the kit. Take these 3 bolts out, put the set screw into one of these holes. It helps retain all this coupler together. And then we're going to slide this tube onto here and secure it. And then we'll put the paddles on. When you get the paddles, they're going to be pre-assembled. All you have to do there is take 1 bolt out, separate the paddle, slip it over here, put it back on, and align it with the center of the row and tighten the bolts. There's 3 of them on there. Tighten them evenly all the way around. And then after these 2 reel tubes are installed, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to put a plug in the end of each tube, put a little silicone or other suitable adhesive on it, and insert it into the end of the tube here. Now that we have the tube installed, we've tightened all the bolts. I've got my eccentric ring tightened onto the bearing on the other arm. We're ready to put these paddles on. So as you get them, they're going to be pre-assembled. Just take out the 1 bolt. The only thing to really pay attention to here is that we want the paddle to be facing like this onto the arm, so that as the paddle goes around the arm, it's going to pull the crop in and then drop it as it goes into the row unit here. If we were to turn the paddle around the other way so that this was the leading edge, it's going to take the material and just bring it back around with the paddle and throw it out front again. So we want to have it facing this way, line it up with the middle of the row, and then tighten the 3 bolts and do that across the whole head. After installing our paddles on the reel, there's a couple things left for us to do. Our next thing we're going to do is check our arms to make sure that they're pretty close to where we want them to be. Check our brackets again to make sure they're where we want them to be. And then come back and put the weld on here like we talked about at the beginning, where we've got the paint ground off. Put a weld on each side, paint it, and we're done with this part. After installing our reel tubes here and all our paddles, we're ready to set the height of this reel. And the first thing we need to do is we need to lower the reel as far down as it's going to go, extend the fore and aft so that the reel is all the way out to the front. And we're going to measure this distance from this idler to the bottom of this tube. And the measurement we're looking for is 375 millimeters. And to do that, we're going to loosen a jam nut on this cylinder at the base of the reel lift. And using a 17 millimeter wrench, we can turn the shaft on the cylinder in and out of an eye bolt to raise and lower this tube. The reason we want it at 375 is that way that when we're operating the reel, whether it's all the way out in the front or somewhere in the middle or all the way to the back, it's not going to be getting into the gathering chains. It's going to clear them through the whole motion of the travel. In the kit for rigid heads that haven't had an ICF system before are these 2 caps, and they have a little thumb screw on the end of them. What they're for is if there's ever a problem in the field where you don't have power, or the computer has failed and we aren't able to operate this with the computer from the cab, we can manually override the hydraulic functions here to operate the different settings. So if we say need to operate deck plates and we don't have power, we can take these caps off the end. Each of these circuits are pairs, left and right. And so we need to take off 2 of the caps that were there. Then we would install these 2 caps on in place. And then with no pressure in the system, we would turn these thumb screws in, and these will manually open the valves, and now we have, in this case, our deck plate function from the combine. If we needed to raise the reel, we would just move this down to the next valves, depending if we need to raise it or move it the fore and aft to just maybe get the reel up and out of the way if we've lost power and it's down and in the way. It's just a temporary fix, just so we can keep operating in the field without power. After setting our height and getting our reel paddles here all level across, the last thing we would do before we put all the covers on everything would be to test run the reel. So make sure that all your protective devices are in place, all the shields are in place on any moving parts. And then we'd start the combine up and engage the header and test the operation, make sure that the reel's turning the right direction, that the end row augers turn the right direction, that the reel functions properly up and down, in and out, just like when we were testing it before when we bled the system out. If everything tests out real good that way, we're happy with everything, then we would take and put all the covers over the hydraulics and electrical, and we'd be done with the installation.